Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H Event Space. You are tuned in to Lighting Fundamentals, a bright idea. Of course, this part of our Wednesday, Westcott Wednesday series. I'm already tongue tied already, but this is a wonderful series we've been bringing to you on Wednesdays, of course, hosted by Westcott. So, huge thank you to the team over there and our team who have been producing this and putting it together today. I'd like to welcome Jose Esquilin to the program. Fundamentals, Jose. Everybody needs them, right?
I certainly hope so. Thank you, Derek.
You're
Um,
welcome.
so it is a true honor. I have to say that speaking on the B&H event space and certainly on Westcott Wednesday, it's a brand that has helped develop my photography and taken it to the next level. So thank you very much. I'm humbled and very excited to be here.
Awesome. We appreciate having you on. I will turn it over to you and remind all of our viewers if you guys do have any questions, we will be doing a little bit of Q&A once Jose wraps up here. So stick around for that and feel free to drop your questions into the chat on YouTube. But I will let Jose take over the education. I'll play the background and Jose, I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Thank you, Derek. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Jose Esquilin. As mentioned, I am here incredibly humbled and very appreciative to the B&H event space as well as Westcott for allowing me this 1 hour with fellow photographers or new inspiring photographers. Everyone that would like to learn about what we would call lighting. So I am going to switch over to my board here and give you a little introduction on myself. I am a photographer out of Northern Virginia. I was born in Puerto Rico. I was raised in Florida. I spent 26 years in the military, U.S. Navy, and I retired in 2013. I currently operate my photography business in Northern Virginia and Florida. You heard a little bit of my intro without the glitches, and I apologize. But I was saying I operate my business in Northern Virginia and Florida. I'm also a federal employee. I work for a federal book publisher. Um, and so my, so to speak, 9 to 5 is doing book design and graphics as well as my photography business. My wife is a nurse, and we have two young men. One is 24. He is a mixed martial artist out of Miami. And we have our youngest who's going into his second year at college. He's 19. And wrapping up our family is our pup named Bruno. You see him on the bottom of the screen there, looking all regal. So my journey started when I was exiting out of the military. I was kind of looking at what I could possibly do my second career, and always being an artistic person. I sort of wanted to lean that way, and but I wasn't quite sure. I was contacted by a company, a contractor at the time, interested in me doing graphics for this one particular in support of the military. So I was doing that for 5 years, but I still wanted to pursue something independently, something artistic. And so as my young adult son now was coming up through high school, like many other parents, they pick up a camera and they want to take action shots, right? And so that was my initial motivation. Um, but my issue was that I wanted to take these Sports Illustrated photos. Again, the creative mind was kicking in, but I wasn't getting those results. And it was because I just wasn't familiar with how to do photography. I wasn't familiar with how to look for a composition, nor was I familiar with the settings. So that was my single most motivation factor for learning how to shoot photography. Um, as I progressed, I went from a fear of, off-camera lighting into what I currently do now, which is 99.9% always using off-camera strobes or lighting. Um, and as I say, I learned many examples of how not to do it. And anytime I get a chance to speak to a new photographer or starting off photographer, I always want to give them that advice, right? Because my budget went from non-existent to now what I call business expenses, business supporting expenses. So My style of photography current day is dramatic lighting. I always am looking for a properly exposed photograph in camera. Apart from what I bring to the table with the lighting, I want to make sure that I am pretty sound, that I am not leaving it to chance. So my exposures, and I'll go through that in the presentation, um, how I establish what that baseline for exposure is. I like a contrasty image. I like, as you see in the example, I love contrast. I love the use of colors, uh, especially in strobes or with gels. Whenever possible, like to tell that story um, and connect with that client. Even if it's a commercial client, it should have some connection to them. And so that's how ideally my clients are. That relationship between my clients and myself is what they're looking for to the next level and something in line with my style. And when those two entities come together, that's a representation of my vision. So in a nutshell, that is what I like to see on my frames. Um, all my equipment um, has progressed over the years. My first camera was a T3i, and it wasn't um, something that I would say was the greatest camera in the world, but it served the purpose at the time. And in reality, many years later, I purchased a additional T3i because I wanted to go back to the basics, get away from all the bells and whistles that I have on my R5 and go back to, what I would say entry level photography, so that it really forced me to go back to the basics. All my lenses are either RF or L mount. It is just over the years, as I mentioned, they're business expenses, right? But they're business investments. Um, Lighting, that was also another long path until I came across Westcott. And I say that because many starting photographers, when they get into lighting without knowing lighting, look for a good budget price on lighting. Um, we've all seen the online marketers that promise several lights, a backdrop, this this grip, that grip, whatever it is, and they wrap it up in a bundle for $150 or something, and it seems like, hey, that's perfect. And that was the path that I took because, again, I was uneducated with light, and so I have plenty of that type of equipment stored. I no longer use it, collects dust. So a couple years ago, I had stumbled across when the FJ 400s first came out. I was intrigued, and that's when I started making investments into my lighting as opposed to spending money on my lighting. Some of the other pieces of grip gear or um, auxiliary support equipment, I would say, I use the Westcott line of modifiers as well as the optical spot. It all just depends on what exactly I'm looking to shoot, how I want to shoot it, how I want to light it, and I use the appropriate modifiers to try to get that job done. So I wanted to really distinguish in my presentation light versus lighting, because light was something that I learned without realizing it. Light was all around us. If we shoot, especially like sports, street photography, anything dealing with ambient light, um, that is the study of light. And so as I was learning that exposure triangle, as I was learning the in and outs of my camera, um, I was also, no pun intended, absorbing the light and seeing how it fell on the subject. I wanted to see the contrast where the shadows were hitting, and so that became my first instructor, uh, watching and observing light, seeing where it was coming from, the intensity. Was it in, coming through the trees, dapple lighting, that kind of stuff. So I want to distinguish between light and lighting as we go through this presentation. So when I study that light around you, and I recommend this for anybody getting into off-camera flash, before making investments, again, not spending money on equipment, but making investments into your equipment. Study that light when you are out, and if you're doing a high school football game, Many times I would catch myself looking at the sun. If I was there for one particular team, the direction that the sun was hitting them as they were advancing, when they were on offense, and if that produced better results as opposed to having them in shadows, that's the side of the field that I would lean towards or go towards. I'd always be chasing the light so that I didn't have to struggle with my settings in camera. And as we know, when it's poorly lit, low lighting, we're raising those ISOs if we want to keep up that shutter speed. So to avoid confliction within my camera and the camera settings, I would just look for the light. So first lesson I would say is look for the light and studying the direction, the intensity that it's coming from. When we're talking about lighting, now it's a different ball game because once I learned what I wanted to produce, now I have the ability to take those strobes, place them in the direction of my subject, and then modify them the way that I want them, either by distance, as we may know, the inverse square law, right? Or I may use a strip box, I may use a beauty dish. That is how I control and shape the light. So now the light versus the lighting is what I'm playing with. So as we progress, that's what I would like, for you to kind of understand. When I'm outdoors, like in this particular picture I took in Ireland, it was nearly 9 o'clock at night. There was no existent light, but I knew that exposure triangle. I knew what I needed to do in camera because I needed to bring the light into the photograph in order to create a composition. When I'm outside, I have to look for that sun's intensity. Is that exposure going to cause my subject to be blown out? Is my exposure going to put that individual, that subject, too far into shadow? I'm looking at, am I in shade? Do I have the ability to put my subject into the shaded area or something that is not as intense, versus like dapple lighting where the sun is peeking through the leaves and it causes, maybe artistically pleasing for some, but for most it may be, lighting that just doesn't look quite appropriate for your subject. And the other factor in outdoor shooting for light, we always look for that golden hour, that beautiful sunset, or even in early morning. Why? Because the sun isn't as harsh. The colors are much more natural. But these are factors that when you are shooting in just natural light, you have to adjust to, right? You're not showing up whenever you want to, creating your composition. You have to work with the surrounding light. Indoors, we face those issues, whether you're shooting a wedding without any strobes or off camera flash. If you are shooting an event, a sporting event, you are basically up to the mercy of those fluorescent, incandescent, or DJ lights. Okay. And so, again, you are not able to control that composition simply by using light all the time. Now, I'm not knocking natural light. If that is what primarily you are interested in, that is what you need to keep expanding and, on your skill sets. Being that I'm a off-camera flash photographer, I want to demonstrate some of the key factors that I studied in light in order for me to learn lighting. So looking at one example here, you see a old-fashioned bike up against a tree. This particular example I took just a couple of weeks ago. It was at my mother-in-law's house, and she had placed this bicycle adjacent to this tree, and I'd seen it for years. Right, this particular morning I was out taking Bruno for a walk, and the light was just coming in, just so perfect in my opinion, that it highlighted what I wanted. It showcased, it gave me a story, whether I know the actual story or not, but it was observing the light that caught my attention. That is what provided me a composition. It wasn't so much the bike, it was a combination of the bike being lit, illuminated by the sunlight. Other examples of just plain light. I have 4 examples on there. I love when I am not on a commercial gig. to get out, grab my 35 millimeter and find a just interesting location, look for things such as the skateboard um, going by. Some is absolutely, pure luck. You can't predict the things that you're going to find, but when you're in an environment and you see where the light is being casted, perhaps that's your opportunity to get into a position that best provides you an outcome that's going to be, a photograph that makes a difference. The lady on the subway waiting on the train, the way that the light was hitting her, the gentleman taking a smoke break. I shot that through my car window. I looked over my mirror. It was just what caught my attention. And then the one shadow at the train station there. Obviously, again, trying to tell that story through the use of light. This young man was another example of the use of light. San Juan, Puerto Rico. He was playing his accordion, sitting on a doorstep. He was inside an area that was slightly covered and provided just enough shadowing so that the sun wasn't overblowing the exposure. At the same token, just enough sun was hitting him. There was just no question about it. I saw the moment. I mean, obviously, I had to wait until he was moving around, but I was fortunate enough, found in between two cars and took the shot. Looking at the light is what drew me to that composition. So, moving away from the light, I want to talk about the lighting. That was probably the biggest obstacle in my photography career, and it's safe to assume that um, it's that journey is still not over. I am constantly learning. I am picking up tips. I look at just like everybody else. I look at online YouTube presentations. Several photographers that I follow their work very closely, admire, like Eli Infante, and Ian Spanier, Glenn Dewey, JC, uh, Gary. The list goes on and on. But those are individuals that, I look at their work and I study the light. How can I look and do certain features that caught my attention? How can I reproduce that into my photography? When you're outside, I'm no longer looking at the same factors of light because now I am trying to control it. My outdoor exposure is just the opposite of what I was describing in the use of light. Now I am adjusting my camera, uh, raising that shutter speed and, lower my ISO so that it produces a darker background, more of a dramatic sky, if you will. I do that because I know that I have the strobes with me that's going to fill in those shadows. And so I don't have to worry about certain aspects like high ISO or grain because I can adjust it in camera or use an ND filter if need be. Um, because I know that those strobes from Westcott, they're going to be strong enough to fill in those shadows and give me the results I want. When I'm indoors, exposures are pretty standard in the sense that I'm looking for a black screen. So I try to keep it underneath my sync speed of 1/200th. So I'm not going into the high speed sync range. I set my aperture. And once I have a black screen on the back of my camera, then I go to work with my lighting. Um, I use lighting to my advantage. This example, it was on the splash screen as well. This young man was going to nationals that particular year, and I wanted to capture. I'd finished doing their high school senior banners, and I wanted something kind of unique that met my style. And so I had one light. You see in the top right hand corner there behind the scenes. I had one long throw, Westcott 45-degree long throw in a FJ 400, aimed off center to him. And all I asked was that he simply do his thing. Now, where I had the luck was getting that timing. I expected to have to do a couple of takes to get him, over that hurdle exactly at the point, but the first shot, it was done. I was so, I was jumping for joy when I saw the back of that exposure. We had done it. So this is an example of where I was able to, adjust my shutter speed uh, to get that dramatic sky detail, but focus the lighting onto the subject to get the dramatic shot you see in front of you. Three more examples. I like to do at times, apart from my portraits, and my business is primarily portrait photography, headshot, as well as I like to do client work. Um, but during the holidays, when I find downtime, I also like to do personal projects. And the first example there, my good friend Tony decided he would agree to sit as a model, willing model. Um, that is this composition that I built up using 5 separate strobes to get that background lit properly. You see some Christmas lights in there. I didn't want to blow them out because I needed that sense of place. And a couple of other lights as key as fill as hair light to give me that impression. Um, and again, whenever I say, it's a good photograph, that's always going to be in my opinion, but I hope you like it as well. The second photograph is an example of a more stoic looking portrait. This young man wanted to produce photographs now so that his children in the future would know what dad looked like. So that was a very simple 2 light setup. One as a hair light behind him to camera left, and one in front as his key to camera right. The last example, bringing into lighting, um, I was asked to photograph a model at a local diner. She's part of a local club that does fundraising events. In this particular case, they were doing a calendar. And I was selected to photograph her in this particular local diner. I did a site scouting and realized very limited space. So I could not bring a large assortment of lights, but they had to be intentional. And so one light off to camera left as the key, and I used the reflector. And it was just enough to where I can crush a little bit of the ambient so that that wasn't overwhelming in the frame, but a prime example of studying the light and using my lighting as a reference to build my composition. So my process, and it's very challenging whenever you're not doing an actual live event to demonstrate lighting. And so I'm going to describe a little bit of my process, and hopefully the things that I mentioned are either stuff that you're considering looking into, questioning, or perhaps it's reinforcement of what you're doing. So this is my particular process of how I set up my lighting. Um, in most of the experiences that I have with clients. So 4 things that I need to maintain always, right? That I have to understand the basics, and I recommend that we all stick to those whenever we can, right? Knowing what a good exposure is in camera before you start setting up your lighting. You need to start from a baseline. For me, is as I mentioned, creating that black screen. If you want some of that ambient, perhaps your screen is not as black, but know where you're going to be without the added lighting. Um, One of the things that I think I fell subject to was I'll fix it in post. I use that sparingly nowadays. When I shoot raw, obviously we have to tweak a little bit of the contrast. We tweak maybe a little bit of the exposure and sharpening. That's not kind of where I'm getting at. But when we create an exposure so far away from the final product, it translates almost to like cooking a perfect steak, or boiling the perfect broccoli, right? And you have it to taste, and then you overcook it, and now it tastes burnt. It's no longer that delicious meal you were expecting. So the similar thing is how I look at photographs. If I can't prepare it correctly in camera, uh, I shouldn't be that far off where I have to go overcook it in post. Knowing my gear, the camera, that transitions across all spectrums, whether you're shooting a Sony, whether you're shooting a Fuji, whether you're shooting a Canon. You should know your gear, just like the limitations it has, the ISO ranges that you're willing to accept. But part of that also is your strobes. Like I said, when I started going down the path of identifying my, so to speak, partner in crime when I'm shooting my photography, is strobes. And when I started doing the research on Westcott, I found that it hit almost every single um, check in the box, right? The only thing was that I just didn't know how many I was going to need. But I knew that it was consistent with power. I knew how many flashes that I was going to be able to get out of one battery, over 450 on one charge. I knew that my color temperature was going to be consistent. So I know that Westcott FJ series has my back. Be objective when you are shooting, right? You want to broaden that experience. You want to broaden your capabilities, right? Um, but you also need to be able to recognize when you have a bad exposure. If you look at an image and if it's blurry, it's blurry. Um, don't try to sell yourself on it unless that's what you were looking to do. I shot for Max Preps to build a little bit more of my continuity in sports. And the first thing they taught me is always look at the eyes. If your eyes are not in focus, unless for some reason artistically you don't want to do that, then your photo is not in focus. Don't fall in love with it and accept it. Know how to be objective of your own work. Be willing to learn. Obviously, if you're watching this, you're investing into your knowledge base. There's tons and tons of examples of photographers' work on Instagram or YouTube. I would encourage you to find a niche, the ones that interest you the most. You can come to my Instagram. I don't have a huge following, but I always try to teach and educate with every post that I do. Um, but what you want to do is, as you are learning, you want to become familiar. Reach out to those that know what you want to do. In other words, you know a local photographer that's experienced, if you know somebody on Instagram or YouTube, send them a message, but get to know your craft, right? Don't assume you know. Get to know it and expand on that knowledge. But the one hard lesson that I went through was, if you want honest feedback, don't ask family, don't ask a friend. They're going to love it. They're going to like it. They're going to thumbs up every photo you take. If you want hard criticism, look at other photographers, ask them to look at your portfolio, ask them to look at your photos. You know, you're going to get the best feedback. And you should have somebody that you trust and value to give you that feedback. They don't need to be insulting, right? They need to be encouraging. So the fundamentals of my lighting, again, when I am outdoors, I expose for the ambient light to get that exposure as best as I can. I keep it flexible so that I can get that exposure. Reducing the detail in the sky is not going to really produce what I want. So I want to increase the details. And how do I do that? I increase that shutter speed, crush a little bit of that ambient, reduce that ISO, perhaps increase my aperture. Now, the one thing about aperture that we always got to remember, it does affect your strobe power, right? So your shutter speed is affecting your ambient light. Your aperture is going to affect your strobes. So as you decide what your exposures are, realize that you can adjust the intensity that you see on your subject through your aperture. So again, when I'm outdoors, exposed for my ambient, then I fill in with my strobes. When I'm indoors, I always start baseline under my sync speed and work my strobes as needed. The thing that we need to consider that when we're outside, there are two factors, outdoor or indoor, right? Is the type of modifiers that we're going to put onto those strobes. There are some that create a very soft light. Um, some are used for detail, for beauty. But I need modifiers that are going to throw that light that gives me the maximum efficiency of those lights. And so I may go with silver umbrellas because I want some of that specular highlight that those umbrellas create when I bounce into it. I often use the 36-inch beauty dish by Manny Ortiz out of Westcott. Uh, Many a times I may take off that outer layer diffusion so that I'm not losing any of the intensity of the light. Um, but essentially, my modifiers are what kind of sculpt the light. The strobes is what pushes the light. So when I'm indoors, fairly similar. I choose my modifiers accordingly. Um, and in my next couple of slides, I'll show a kind of a basic setup of how those modifiers work for me as opposed to me trying to work for the modifiers. They need to show up to work on time and be ready to work for me, not, check in and then decide to take on a break. I need modifiers, I need strobes, I need camera equipment that's ready to go. Um, Very simple. Obviously, it's Westcott Wednesday. No hiding that. But I use Westcott. I'm not paid by Westcott. I simply use the product. I believe in the product, and I wouldn't be speaking on lighting if it wasn't for them. Honestly, they provided me a win-win situation so that I can produce the type of artwork that I'm known for, or that I've become known for. And I have to say that beyond anything else, that Westcott, their gear and the reliability, I think the last component that truly sold me on that was customer service. If you can relate to this, if you have a company that you use and you have any issues or concerns or questions, give them a call, and hopefully, they get in touch with you soon via email or maybe a call back or so forth. I can tell you 100% of the time, anytime I have an issue or question, I can call Westcott during working hours. And usually, I think 2 or 3 rings tops. And a couple of the folks there, especially Andrea, who is always carrying a smile through the phone. So if you're into customer service and you want a good, reliable product, there's my plug. Westcott, definitely. Um, but I use a full line of their backdrops. I use their lights and their modifiers as mentioned. The exposure, you want to test those exposures and in relation to your subject. Now, I may do a 4 light setup. I may do a 5 light setup. Uh, those setups, each light is set up, placed, modifier, and tested. I want to check whether if I'm using my light meter or I want to basically look at my histogram. How is that light affecting my subject? My post processing, I mentioned before, I try to keep it slight, but primarily I do is cleaning up of grip equipment. If I need to, based on the circumstances, bring in a modifier a little bit closer than I'd want to, based on light efficiency, then I'm going to need to take that out in post. So that's the bulk of my post processing. And the last bit is to create. I mentioned a few talented photographers earlier. I look at their body of work. I look at their body of work for inspiration, but imitation does not make you stand out. Um, I don't want to become a photographer whose work is looked upon and confused for somebody else's. There's so much influence out there, and they're, beautiful compositions and incredible images. Uh, but if I'm just there to repeat their work, I'm not really establishing myself as a photographer, in my opinion. Many times my client will bring me examples, and that's fine. I just don't want to go down a rabbit hole where I am not that photographer and I don't produce the work that they're seeing. So again, inspiration is great, but imitation doesn't make you stand out. You're going to see a very crude snapshot here I took of my backdrop setup. Uh, I place my lights again strategically, and depending on where I am at with my subjects, how I need to light them, what is the final product intended to look like. whether it be the Pro Light mods, whether it be the smoke, whether it be a gel. However, that particular session is intended to look is how I'll do my setup. Make sure your camera, your lighting, and your modifiers are ready to go. I always pack the night before. I do a checklist that allows me to make sure I have everything going. I don't assume that, my lights are going to function. They physically get turned on, the batteries get charged, the camera gets charged, SD cards. So make sure that your camera, your lighting, and your modifiers and any grip equipment is at your disposal ready to go, but that it's ready to work. Again, show up to work, ready to work. You see this example here in the image. It doesn't always have to be complicated. This particular model, we were inside a parking garage. It was pretty bright outside, but we were kind of in that shaded area. And I needed to fill it in just enough to establish my composition. I used an FJ200, small portable 200-watt second strobe, along with a Pro Grip, so you can hand hold it. Put a modifier, an Octa S, on there, and one light, and we were able to produce something that I, put into my work portfolio. I mentioned investment earlier. Do not spend money, but rather invest money into gear, right? And the biggest factor is that if you're not going out and doing your research, you're not understanding the gear you're about to purchase, then the problem occurs with you end up realizing after the purchase, this isn't what I needed. So I recommend you take advantage of every resource you have online. You can hopefully take my advice because I've been down this path. Invest in your equipment so that it will pay dividends in the future. I have, again, the full spectrum of lighting for Westcott simply because what did they provide me? They had that checklist that I mentioned. They met every expectation. The weight of the strobe was reduced. Battery, so I no longer had to worry about where am I going to plug in. If I had a portable like generator, no cords, so the battery powered, exceptional, over 450 shots on a full charge. Color temperature, if you're starting out especially and you're wondering, why is this particular image looking a little bit yellow? It's because of that color temperature in the lighting, whether it's your ambient lighting or whether it's the strobes that you're using. If you're not familiar with the color temperature your strobe is producing, you're always going to be off. We do have the advantage of, the white balance in Lightroom, but I can't tell you the last time I had to do that simply because I know that these are consistent. So my FJ400 shooting at 5500, 5600. I just go into camera under white balance, set that temperature, and I know that they're locked in. I don't really have to worry about it. It's one less factor. The trigger, the XJM3 was a game changer for me simply because I could put that on my hot shoe and instantly I didn't have to run around, do cartwheels, and sing in order for my trigger to connect to my strobes. It's just on and connects. So that was a huge plus in the Westcott ecosystem for me, is that everything just talks to each other. Uh, if I was to shoot a different brand of camera, there is an assortment of other brand of cameras that trigger will uh, function with. So I can scroll through there. I may have, Canon, or there may be another shooter that's shooting Fuji or something to that effect, Nikon, something that is not my brand. If it offers that option in the menu of the trigger, they can put it on their hot shoe and they're good to go. They're connected to my lights. Their customer service, again, I can't say that enough. I mean, honestly, it is a big, huge deal that I'm able to resolve my issue 99.9% of the time right on that phone call without having to wait a couple days for technical support to reach back out to me. So if I'm on site and have an issue or a question, it's resolved. Uh, And so they're fairly lightweight. I can pack them away easily. They offer a modeling light. I believe it's a 20 watt, so that helps you kind of establish your composition. And through the lens and high-speed sync functions, as well as several other modes that are more advanced if that's what you're looking at doing. So this is why I invested into lighting with Westcott, as opposed to the previous brands that just didn't meet my criteria. Let me talk to you a little bit about the exposure. So we talked about in-camera exposure, right? But how do I set up my frame in order for me to be able to communicate with my lights and effectively adjust that? So there's a little video playing there. It's time warp there. This is a typical session for me. You'll see that where I'm setting up two X-drop systems to create that black background. So again, I don't have to compensate for it in my camera. So while I'm setting that up, you'll see that I bring the lights out. I'll put them into the modifiers. I have a little bit of OCD, so when I pack my lights, I put them in a sequence so that the first light is in group A, the second light is group B, and so forth. So when I take them out of my case, they're already ready to go. I know where to place that particular strobe in a circle formation. And then I'd keep it fairly simple and straightforward every single time. My primary light, my key light, that goes into group A. My secondary light, which are my edge lights, is my group B. If I'm putting lights in between them, then that'll be group E. So B and E are my edge lights, and I do that so I can control them independently. I could group them together, but I prefer to keep them. Hair light C, D, and my fill light is last. And as you see in this diagram here, it's basically a top-down view of how I set up my lights around my subject, the subject being the star, with the groupings. And I do that, and I'm able to adjust everything from the top of my camera on the FJX3. They have two versions. One is for Sony specifically, but the M is more universal, and that's the one I have. So I have my lights. I go independently. I set the power based on the location of that particular source of light in relation to my subject. If I find myself that perhaps I don't want to go as high and maybe conserve a little bit of battery, I may have to bring in that modifier slightly closer, which then takes me back to where I was saying in post, sometimes I may have to do some post-processing and removing grip gear. But essentially what you see here is my world or my circle of light when it comes to most of my sessions with athletes. These are some examples, a variety of setups. The first one using two lights adjacent, or I guess directly to the left and to the right, off center from my subject, producing kind of that more three-dimensional chisel. I chose to give it a darker background just to separate them. Again, they're not necessarily choices you may make with your photography, but these are the choices artistically that I was making. And that is, again, it could be somewhat subjective in your opinion, but look at the exposure is what I'm going to say. At least the exposure for me is where I want it. The background, that kind of stuff, that's where you're going to come in and adjust to your taste. Second example, I use those Pro Light mods that basically will cover the strip boxes. They have such an assortment available on their Westcott website. That was a mouthful. But basically, it's to simulate a stadium. And in this particular case, this drill team athlete, I wanted to give the presence of her being on stage. So my key light was a little bit brighter so that it made it look like a spotlight was hitting her. Followed up by the smoke and the ambience of that the Pro Light mods produce. Last example, edge lighting, key lighting, and one backlighting. It was illuminating through. I had smoke going, so it was illuminating the blue with a gel. Flexi Gels by Westcott again. But it gives me that tone and basically just giving me that environment that I want. A little bit, few more examples, same scenarios. You see, a lot of my athlete work is done at schools. We do them for high school banners. And so I shoot with the intent of demonstrating the athlete in their particular sport. At the same time, I want to be able to utilize them if I'm going to do a composition, if I need to cut them out, whatever the case is. So it's serving a dual purpose. Uh, these particular images I don't sell individually, so uh, I'm lighting for again the end process being those banners. But clearly, you see the effects of that setup of lighting that I mentioned before. You see edge lighting, you see the key lighting, backlighting. Everything is done in a way that the power of the lights complement each other. And I'm again adjusting that power through my trigger. Post processing, fairly straightforward, very simple. I keep it clean, minimize on those you know, those sliders. I don't try to go for high score on the sliders. Uh, I clean up my background if need be, chords if need be, but I try to keep it in pre-visualize when I look at my frame, what I absolutely can move out of it, so I have less time in post-processing. Uh, I'll do a dodge and burn if required, just to accent a little bit of the muscles in a particular athlete and retouching of the skin. My golden rule is, like for acne, if they have a blemish or they have something that wasn't there 2 weeks ago, it most likely won't be there in 2 weeks from now. It's fairly safe to say I can remove it, but I always ask if I'm in question. I always ask them, and I find that to be the easiest route as opposed to removing something that shouldn't have. You remove a skin tag that maybe they become familiar with or a mole. So I don't leave anything to chance. I just ask them flat out, and I'm just honest with them, and I find that's the easiest way. I want to express that the biggest challenge for me going from being a light photographer into lighting, you certainly create either way. But I found for my particular interest, my particular art style, most of the time when I'm creating, building my photo, I wanted to use lighting. It allowed me to be able to create the scene, replicate the scene if need be. And um, I found that it's much more practical with lighting because you can create beautiful examples and put them in environments. You can create individuals in a gymnasium or out on the field. You see here that these three examples, the first two were indoors. My top-down example of the umbrella, I boomed that over my subject, shot some rim lights in the smoke. Similar thing outside, as I mentioned before, I adjusted my exposure uh, and filled it in with strobes. Two more examples, or three more examples. One was a dancer that you see here as a moving example there, long exposure that essentially I wanted to capture that motion within the photograph. The swimmer, like setting up the lighting from the side, asked him to stand on the sidewall and push off and exhale, producing the bubbles. The last one, it was a product shot for this company. Just needed to get him in the action. So those lights helped me freeze that environment. A couple more examples of some athletes. Same setup with the Pro Light mods, the smoke, consistent as far as what you're seeing in the background. But I want, again, the exposure on them is not all the same. It was all adapted to the particular subject and the style. So the lighting setup is fairly similar, but you have to learn to look at the light in order to be able to adjust it and have it work for you. Um, quickly run down again use the strobes surrounding the environment, surrounding the athlete, producing the type of work and lighting and effects, the contrast that I talked about uh, is primarily, my recipe. I'm going to give you this example here of using light, consistent light, illuminating this subject in order to create that wave. All of this was done in camera, as you see here in the example off to the left. Um, I used a 2-second exposure, two FJ400s set at second curtain sync, and one continuous light to help produce those kind of effects. Again, I am creating the environment, creating the scenario through the use of lighting. One last example, this is my oldest. We wanted to do a parody of Die Hard, so hopefully someone is familiar with that movie. A little behind the scenes that you see him, we created a simulated air vent out of boxes, lined it in with silver paper, and got it properly exposed. Set up my background light, which was an FJ200 with a gel, and then two FJ80s flash to produce my key and fill. So you can find ways to creatively use your light and create compositions that far exceed what you may find you're able to do with just natural light. Create and just create. Get out there, take out your camera, get creative, and who knows, you may be able to find a way that you can start producing examples of your creativity. You may find that you will have a subject in your camera, and then all of a sudden that creative juice starts sparking. When you start learning the use of lighting, you can now control what is set to darks, what is set to bright, what is set to midtones. You can change your colors. You can adapt your lights to exactly what your vision needs. And that is to produce quality photographs, illuminated, lit by lighting. So go out there and create. Final thoughts that I'd like to discuss before we open it up for questions and answers: always speak with your clients so that you understand what, in fact, is the assignment. Don't go there just imposing your style across the board. They're probably coming to contact you because they've seen your work. And so discuss it with your client. Make sure there's no surprises. Plan out your session, your arrival times, your transportation of gear. Make sure that everything is packed early enough so that you're not running late. When you learn you're studying the light to learn lighting. Again, get out there. And if you don't have investments into strobes yet, look at the world around you. You don't need a camera in front of you. You can just see where the light is coming in, the intensity. And in your mind, you can kind of express, how would I change that? How can I change that subject in order for me to illuminate them properly? Invest in your gear. Don't spend in your gear, right? Don't spend on your gear. Make sure that those investments are done wisely, that you've done your homework, that you research, and that if you're spending a certain amount or investing a certain amount of money into your gear, that this is going to produce the results that you want. You want to consider that they're reliable, they're practical, they're durable, and their customer service is number one. And always have a backup plan. So a couple places to find me, and beforehand, I'm super excited. Two things kind of came down on me today. One was obviously this class. I was super excited to be presenting here for Westcott Wednesday on B&H, but I also finally got notification that my book, You Are the Director, is available for purchase. It was huge. This is a collaboration with a few individuals for quite some time. And so coincidentally, it dropped today on Amazon. So I think they're going to place the link in the chat. So hopefully you can support me. You can find me on Instagram, Jose Esquilin Photography. I hope that you jot that down because it's a mouthful. YouTube, same thing. And my website at joseesquilinphotography.com. Again, thank you. It was a lot. And when you're not doing this live to demonstrate lighting, it becomes a little bit of a challenge. But I will extend this that if you reach out to me and you have a particular question, all answers. Okay. I can talk to anyone anytime. I like to, communicate about photography. So if you have any questions, certainly send me a message. I appreciate a follow. I don't have a huge following, but you know, with your support, I might, start getting it out there. Um, and again, a lot of information to throw at you at once. Hopefully, some of the images left enough of an impact. And review the film. Review this video. That's why they host it, so that if you have any questions or something went past too quickly, by all means. So I appreciate it, and that's. Let's open it up for questions if we have any.
Awesome. Huge thank you to Jose for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to double down on that. The book, super affordable, Jose, and it's exciting, man. It's exciting to get your first published piece out there to the world where anybody can access it. So huge congrats to you.
Thank you. Like I said, it was just too crazy. I was building up for this class today, and so of course getting the nerve, so to speak, out of my mouth so I can speak without tongue tying. But then when I received the notification that the book was out, I am the director is how I kind of look at it. It applies to really anything. You go out there, you become in charge of whatever you want to do and own it, just own it. So thank you.
No, that's awesome. And of course, it probably makes it easier when I start the workshop with tripping over my own tongue. So I kind of set the table there and
It's
knocked
okay.
everything down. But we will move into the Q&A. Michelle has a friend just starting in photography and lighting, bought an FJ200 recently. Is having a hard time shooting at high noon with no shade. Her camera, she said she doesn't think her camera has a high speed sync. That's always a tricky one. I know I have some FJ400s, and I'm going to throw it over to you. But in my experience, I mean, the sun is the sun.
The
It
sun
is
is the sun.
the mother of all light, and sometimes you would need all the lights in Hollywood to overpower the sun. Sometimes it
That
seems.
is true. That is true. And so, Michelle, so one of the a couple of suggestions I would have. Number one, if you have the ability to bring your subject into the shade, that's your best bet. Primarily is because you're going to kind of conserve a little bit on how much power you have to put out of that strobe. You have to understand you're not so much overpowering the sun. That sun is, I don't know how many thousands upon thousands of degrees, right? So to overpower with a 200 watt strobe may be challenging. But I will tell you, I'll give you some suggestions. You want to see if perhaps using an ND filter will bring that exposure down, right? Um, get into that exposure, as I mentioned, find out without the strobes, right? How can you reduce that ambient light on its own? How can the camera reduce it? Increase that shutter, um, lower that ISO, perhaps increase your aperture, right? Close it down so that you're at around an f7.1, f8, right? Or maybe up to f16. However, you can lower that exposure before you introduce the strobe is how I would best handle that first case. Um, Now, once you have that exposure the way that you want it in camera, now you're going to have to introduce the strobe. Two factors are going to play into it. One, because it's at 200 watt seconds, you're going to probably need to be close to power 9, right? Maybe power 8, um, and bring that strobe closer into your subject as close as you can without being in frame. And also look at your modifier, the type of modifier you're using. Is it shooting a wide beam? Is it shooting a narrow beam? Are you using a modifier that perhaps has double diffusion? Take out one of the diffusion panels, take off the second diffusion panel, and just experiment. Just don't make it a client. Perhaps somebody that will fill in, get that exposure correct in camera, and then introduce the strobe and adjust the power so that the strobe is leveling out the exposure however you want to.
Yeah, I want to go back to two things. I think you hit on two really, really great points there that a lot of people kind of underestimate or overlook. So I want to bring attention to them because it's like you're so good at what you do, man. You're just nonchalantly just dropping gems, and I really want to call those out. going in the shade. I feel like a lot of people that they have questions on shooting in the sun, and it's like the first question you want to bring up is, well, why does it need to be in direct sunlight? Is that all you have, or is there something like to? I think a lot of photographers think, okay, well, I want to use the sun, but I want to overpower and get this, and you can get that light. I mean, if you want that look of having the sun behind you, and you have two lights, throw a light behind them and get that rim lighting and then just pop a light on them. And I mean, we've seen a ton of photographers and filmmakers create these super realistic looks of sunlight coming through windows and
Right.
flares and all that. So I just wanted to point that out there. And then the second point is I feel like a lot of people underestimate how much light the modifiers can cut down, whether it's the modifier itself or layers of diffusion. A lot of times people don't even realize that a modifier can be used with less diffusion sometimes. Sometimes you have two levels of diffusion in there, and or you have kind of like a buffer layer. So
Yes.
I just wanted to kind of call those out because I feel like a lot of people might, if you're thinking about learning and understanding light, a lot of times it just starts with asking yourself questions. Do I need to use a particular modifier, or can I go bare bulb in certain circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's kind of one of those things that I wanted to highlight, that light versus lighting, right? Because the light, you can't control where that sun is. All you can do is move your subject, move yourself, right? But that light is where it's at. Now, with that being said, to even caveat a little bit more, the modifiers, there's been times where I wanted to use a modifier. It was a silver line, so it's a little bit more specular, right? More reflective. And so I took off both diffusion panels and I angled my modifier so that that silver within inside the modifier was acting as a bounce. All right. So now the sun was hitting my modifier and it was filling in the shadows underneath my subject's chin simply by the modifier being my reflector. And so learning the tools that you have, I don't typically have my subjects face the sun because one, they're going to be blinded and they're squinty, right? But obviously, you are now battling that sun to get lighting on somebody that's already well lit, right, by the sun. So a lot of times, simply turning them around, now you can use that sun as a hair light, right, which is going to cast them in shadow. That's where you're going to introduce your strobe to fill in those shadows in the front. Lower that exposure so that you have some detail in your sky, right? Again, through the exposure in your camera or through an ND filter. If you raise that exposure and you pop your strobe in high speed sync, then you fill in the shadows. You don't have to overwhelm your subject with a bright strobe. You're just filling in shadows, and you should have that exposure you're looking for.
So much good information. I think it really boils down to, like you said, you know what your end result, desired end result is. You know what everything is doing, and I think it's really just lighting is a mathematical equation when you break it down. It's like I need the light using the reflector and the silver reflective surface. It's like if you had to pull a sunshade that you put on the windshield of your car out and
Correct.
use it as a reflector. It's like it's just understanding what you're trying to get, what you have at your disposal. And I think that's the important thing that you're teaching here. That is just it's invaluable information. I want to
Yeah.
sneak one more question in here for you, Jose, from Kevin. Says, thank you so much for sharing, Jose. With your typical pricing, how many edited images do you provide to an athlete on a school shoot?
So, my current business practice, my business motto is not so much about shooting the portrait. So, or I should say the prints. What I do is I contract with the high schools for the seniors, and I will photograph their seniors so that we produce a banner and some images that they're able to use within the school. Um, I just don't have the ability to offer more individual sessions because I will typically have anywhere in the neighborhood between 30 and 50 athletes on one particular day. And so if I was to do individual portraits, uh, it makes it challenging to get individual images per athlete. Now, when I contract individually, uh, it's pre-established beforehand. So depending on the package, anywhere between the 3 5 is what is usually included in my prices. But the challenge thing is that, especially with athletes, right? We see a lot of influences on social media. and they were dramatic and incredible images, right? But if you really look at it, those photographers are doing individual sessions per athlete. They're not doing multiple athletes for a couple of photos and moving on. And so that price point, um, they have their established prices per their market. But for me, the work that you see here, unfortunately, I just contract through the school when they come in, and then I create an idea or a theme for the year, and then I just try to keep them consistent.
Awesome. Man, where were these photographers when we were growing up? We got like
Um,
bare bones, bottom of the barrel images, and it's like I'm looking at the hurdler photo. It's like these kids, high school kids, are getting Olympic quality photo shoots, and it's
I
awesome.
I appreciate that. And real quickly, it's funny you say that because I was kind of thinking earlier, like, what were my resources? A lot of it for me was self-taught. Well, what were my resources? So in 2013, at least YouTube wasn't as prominent as it is now, right? Where you can just
Mm.
type in a very simple search and you've got 10 photographers giving you that example. And so I didn't really see that as a resource back then. It may have existed, I just didn't go there. And so it was like literally taking that camera and just tapping my head and saying, okay, if I do this, what does it do? Cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. And so my failures are what taught me my success. And I also made it a kind of a personal promise. Anytime that I experienced a photographer on the field when I was shooting more sports, there was not a stranger, so to speak. I saw somebody with a camera. Either if they came to me and asked me the question, I would always stop what I was shooting, no matter what the action was, and I would answer them because I know I didn't have that resource coming through when I first started. So I was trying to pay it forward. And to this day, whether you reach out to me, on social media, ask me a question, I never see it as challenging as like, why are you asking me? I just want to give you that information based on the lessons that I learned. And if you can use it, great. If you can't, well, let's come back.
I love that approach. And again, we're going to drop the link to Jose's book that just released today. Huge congratulations to him again on that. And I do tell you guys, we love when people support our speakers. And if you haven't learned anything over the past hour, then you clearly had your volume on mute because really a lot of information packed in there. Nice, easy breakdown. I'm going to just throw out a quick answer to a question that did come in on ND filters for kit lenses. Michelle, they make ND filters for everything under the sun. You're going to want to look into quality. Anytime you put a piece of glass in front of a piece of glass, which your lens is, you don't want to take a good glass and ruin it with bad glass, meaning a low quality filter. So look into that. There's all kinds that will screw onto your lens. There's filters that, ND filters for certain systems that go on the backside of the lens. And there are more universal setups that aren't screw on, that is more or less a plate or a piece of film that go over to the front that could be used with various diameter lenses. So that's a very quick 10-second
Yeah,
description
yeah.
on ND lenses. But do you use them often when you're shooting outdoor, Jose?
So I like you just mentioned, there's such a variety of them that I have such an assortment of sizes of lenses, right? So it gets kind of pricey if I was to actually buy one. So I came across one that's reasonable, but it's mounted onto my R5 before I mount my lens, and so the ND filter is built into that adapter. When I know beforehand that it's going to be challenging of an environment, then I will throw that in my bag in case I need to use it. I prefer not to for the simple reason, as you mentioned, you're putting glass in front of glass. Um, you just have to kind of go back into my presentation. Don't spend money on gear, invest in your gear. So do your research. If you see an ND filter in the neighborhood of $250, 300, don't be sticker shocked because what you're reading into that price is that you're basically paying for that quality lens, that quality glass, and the research that went into it to make sure that it is absolutely the best possible solution for what you need. So a $30 ND glass is probably not going to do it. You're going to be figuring it out in post that, yeah, I just wasted my money. And you're going to remember when I said, don't spend money on your gear, invest in your gear.
I love that. Don't spend money on your gear, invest in your gear. Perfect way to close it out right there. Huge thank you to Jose and, of course, the Westcott team for this Westcott Wednesday edition. If you guys do have any questions, of course, we dropped Jose's contact information. Go give him a follow on Instagram. And, of course, the book on Amazon. Well, well, well worth the money. Huge thank you, Jose. And to the rest of the Westcott team out there, thank you guys. To all of our viewers, thank you as well for tuning in. That's all we got for you today. Another edition of the B&H Event Space now in the books. Catch y'all next time.